Standing tall, a rusting sentinel rises proudly, almost defiantly, among soaring walls of stone and glass. Here, in the Segerstrom Center for the Arts in Orange County, a magnificent tower of steel by internationally renowned sculptor Richard Serra invites inspection. This work, named Connector, came into being because philanthropist and arts patron Henry Segerstrom met Richard Serra at an art opening in New York. When two visionaries meet, the results can be extraordinary.
I had spent a great deal of time thinking about the public plaza. It had been almost a neglected issue in design because the architects of the building were not responsible for the architecture of the public plaza. It occurred to me that it would be nice to have a signature piece in the plaza.
The potential for doing something with a significant scale and to be able to build a piece in an urban setting where there's no vehicular traffic, where you're really going to deal with people who are going to traverse a plaza, and the possibility of collecting people into and through and around a sculpture presented something as of a challenge that I was interested in. You need something to compare to the architecture that's non-architectural. And I think what this provides is something that has architectural scale, but has a meaning quite different from architecture in that it is purposely useless. I don't mean useless in terms of aesthetics, I mean useless in terms of utilitarianism. It has no value in terms of use other than its function in terms of walking into, through, and around to look at.
Sculpture as experience is the foundation of Serra's monumental works. For Serra, sculpture is not an object on a pedestal. It is a piece in an environment with which the viewer interacts. Surprisingly, Serra was inspired to make the viewer the subject of his three-dimensional work by two-dimensional work, a painting by Spanish master Diego Velázquez.
I'd made a trip to Madrid, to the Prado, and I saw Velázquez's Las Meninas. And if you've ever seen Las Meninas, you know, Velázquez is looking out at you and you're the subject of the painting. And I was very interested in making the viewer the subject because I thought that was quite progressive. But I thought if I got into 3 dimensions, there was a better chance that I would be able to make the viewer participate in the context.
Although Serra began as a painter, the idea of viewer as subject began to grow. He gave up on painting and began to work with other materials.
I wasn't interested in either modeling or casting. I wasn't really interested in something that could come from the tectonics of building. That notion of dealing with gravity in space and tectonics really appealed to me, so I started doing a series of lead props. And then Jasper Johns asked me to build a piece, one of these molten lead splash pieces that he had seen at the Whitney Museum, in his loft. And I went there with a couple of lead plates that I was going to melt down because I thought, isn't it curious in trying to make something that was going to be a mold, the mold in itself, the form in itself, had a tectonic possibility. So the very next week, I went out and got a plate 8 feet high and 24 feet long, and I bisected a corner and made it freestand. It was called Strike. And once I had done that, that opened up the whole possibility of installation. It was no longer an object in the room. It was you were in the room with something that was dividing and declaring the space. As soon as you're involved with walking and looking, you yourself become the subject matter. The subject matter is your experience over time. How there's no prescribed way of walking, how you can turn on the dime and go here or there. All of that plays into your potential for having an experience that's personal. Now that differs than most which has come before, where if you take sculpture that had to do with figuration with a built-in iconography, like say a equestrian rider, once sculpture got off the pedestal and dealt with the same space of architecture, then people passing into and through and around became one of its primary forms of engagement. Then time really becomes, in terms of one's subjectivity, a large driving force. And time happens to be very individualist and private. And I think everyone experiences time in relation to art in a way that you don't experience everyday time in everyday life.
For Serra, art is vital to expanding our experience.
I think, you know, the difference between Pollock and Cezanne, or Pollock and Warhol, or Giacometti and Matisse, I think they fulfill different poles in one that allows us to think about things we couldn't have thought before, And I'm very happy that there's a painting called The Red Room by Matisse. There are nuances of poetic experiences that if it weren't for artists, I would be less of a person. And there's nothing else in my horizon in my lifetime that's been satisfying in that way. So I think the arts have a lot to do with defining who we are and how we think. So when you say it's a catalyst for thought, it's because it enriches one's life.
Yet sculpture in public places sometimes confounds people.
Well, I think one of the problems you have in America right now in relation to art is that if you put a piece in a, quote, museum context or an aesthetic context or a context that is an art center, then it's a given that people are going to relate to the art probably with a more open mind than if you put it in an urban setting when they're startled because their assumption about their personal space or their public space is being preempted by something that's quite unexpected. But my problem that I've had in the last 40 years in building in public spaces is that as the culture develops sensibilities for commercial interests, like what kind of shoes or neckties or hats or fur coats we're supposed to buy, it doesn't develop sensibilities for the acceptance of aesthetics potentials. So it does nothing to enlighten people or to engage people in what might be a different aesthetic, that sculpture in and of itself is not architecture and sculpture in and of itself is not nature. And yet if you ask people, anyone, to name who are three living sculptors that are relevant to their experience, they probably could not name them. Where they could name 3 movie stars, 3 architects, 3 whomever, filmmakers, maybe even 3 poets. So the notion that sculpture is a viable force in the culture is non-existent. Now, how will it come about that it could be? Only by people building pieces in public spaces and having people respond to them. But if that isn't encouraged, it won't happen.
Henry Segerstrom certainly agrees.
I think that perhaps Richard and I share a purpose in art, and that is to enrich other people's lives as well as our own. It's not a selfish purpose. It really is to create changes in others' lives through the emotional experience of a work of art. With the connector, that happens both visually and physically when you walk through the piece. So that's an added experience and benefit of a connector. Well, you know, all of us, and particularly our children, look at computers all day long, and they look at television, they look at their automobiles. They need a little broadening of their imagination, and I think works of art like this can give that to them.
Given their shared commitment to the importance of public art, Segerstrom and Sarah embarked on a journey that would eventually give birth to Connector.
When I first came out here, he took me to the Noguchi Garden, and he explained to me the relationship that he had had over the years with Noguchi. And I think the Noguchi Garden is a very interesting work. And the fact that he had built that and that he was close to Noguchi and that he has the sensibility and temperament to engage artists of that quality made me like him immediately. He's a very easygoing, patient, thoughtful person.
It was a very important meeting, and Richard came here, but he wanted to personally see where that piece was going to be located. And he's very specific about that. In the contract that we had drawn later, he reserved the absolute right to locate that piece.
Both men agreed that scale was vital to the success of the piece.
I started making models at the scale of 1 inch to a foot and 1/2 inch to a foot. And I went through about 30 models. And I knew pretty much right off that I thought that the site called for something vertical. If you think of this as an open plaza, there's not going to be any car traffic, there's only going to be foot traffic. And you think of the Renaissance and you think of piazzas, you think of a bell tower like the Campanile. And not that this is a bell tower, but it functions urbanistically in the same way that a bell tower would, in that it's going to collect people, it's going to gather people, it's going to draw people to a central point. And basically I thought here what happened was that these buildings needed to be collected. Something needed to be centralized to allow people, when they traverse the plaza, to go into and through and around the structure. And it's my hope that this sculpture will provide that. It will provide a place where people will meet. It will provide a place for people to walk into, through, and around. But it also has a signification as a sign or as a symbol for the entire plaza. Basically, I wanted to build a shaft that, as it rises in elevation, would also torque. And I started with 6 plates. I had one with 8 plates. I had one with 4 plates. And we came to a conclusion after going through several models that a piece with 5 plates in relation to this space, and given the height that we needed and the girth that we needed, would function significantly and also give us a certain kind of vertical thrust that we wanted. Wouldn't be too broad in this space.
Once a design was agreed to, Serra worked with his fabricators in Germany to create the piece. Henry and Elizabeth Segerstrom traveled to Germany to meet the sculpture that was the result of their commission.
Richard Serra has a very unusual provision in his sale of his pieces on a commission basis, and that is that the client takes delivery of the piece at the foundry in Germany. And it's the client's responsibility, not the artist, to take that piece through its transportation from Germany to the site and install it. Now that's very, very unusual. It imposes a huge burden on the client. Elizabeth and I wanted to see where we were getting this piece. And we went to Siegen with the artist and his wife, and we saw the piece for the first time. It had been assembled the weekend before we arrived in a snowstorm. So the piece was really christened by a German snowstorm, and that started the whole process of the rusting of the Corten steel. I went to the piece by myself. I just loved it. I thought it was absolutely marvelous. I put my hand on that piece of steel, and it was almost like I felt a communication coming back through this entity, this art piece that seemed to have almost a life all of its own. And it was if the piece was saying to me, thank you.
Bringing the massive piece to Orange County required a tightly scheduled delivery from the Port of Long Beach. Teams of engineers and riggers were brought in to prepare the site and anchor connector in its final position.
Well, first they had to level a foundation, and they had to drive pylons under the ground. You have earthquake codes here. There are a tendency to turn earthquake codes. So that presented a problem just in terms of sufficient funds for a foundation that was going to hold. I think we're up to 360 ton here. Even though each plate, when it's floating, airborne, looks rather weightless. And the plates themselves look like blades. You don't sense that amount of tonnage. And when you're in it, the vertical rise of the internal volume won't allow you to sense that either.
This work of art is not only an art piece, but it's a marvelous piece of mechanics. To think that you can take steel 2.5 inches thick and warp it and bend it and come to these close tolerances. When those pieces went together, I don't think that there was a quarter of an inch on a length of 65 feet in deviation, and they just fit together. It's like watching ballet. I felt both glee in seeing the piece put together, but apprehension that those steel workers were working with a piece of steel that, if it got out of control, could be very dangerous to them. And the precision with which they put those pieces together, these 65-foot long pieces that are twisted and torqued in a certain manner, all had to fit as precise as a jigsaw puzzle. And one of the things that I noticed about Richard Serra, and he confessed it later in a conversation with me, was that he loved to go out as these pieces of steel were hanging in the air and about to be placed on the ground. He would love to put his hand under the piece and move it just a little bit. And he said that that was one of the greatest thrills of his life, which I thought was fascinating. That was one of his great joys.
When the installation was finished, the Orange County community came together to celebrate. While some are unsure about the slowly rusting patina of the Cor-Ten steel, the installation of a work by Richard Serra has drawn international notice in the world of the arts.
You can look at it a lot of different ways. I mean, I can understand how people could get outraged looking at something like this. They could say, why is that rusty steel derrick out there anyway? On another sense, I can imagine people going into it and having a rush and a thrill and being grateful for the fact that it is there. One doesn't know until one kind of understands what the context is, who the people are, and what their engagement will be. You never know.
Yeah, I think it's a very edgy piece. I think like with everything else Richard Serra does, I think because he's a visionary, I think his pieces of work are so brilliant, they're so experiential, but they're also so far out, they're so different. But I like what Richard said. He said, Henry, I really appreciate that you and Elizabeth had the guts to buy the piece and that you love it, because some people are going to hate it and some people are going to love it. Some people are going to say, well, gee, why don't you paint the other color, or why it is not a mirror or a glass or something which can shine and be special. But he said, with time, you will see. It's like good patina of things. It's going to become a center of something really special in our lives.
The one thing that has salvaged and kept great cities alive in the Western world is where their cultural resources are housed. The institutions that house the product of our artists and our collections are very important to everyone who has access to them. The more young people particularly can be enticed into going through art museums or attending performances, the better our societies will be.
For the future, Connector stands as a monument to the vision of two men, Richard Serra and Henry Segerstrom. This sculpture invites the visitor to experience its shifting moods by day and by night. It invites us to reflect on the place of the arts in society. And it stands ready to connect us all, through the arts, to new ways of thinking about our world.